be represented by when the paradigms actually start to absorb the other paradigm, right? When the paradigm actually consumes the other paradigm, when the paradigm begins to shift, when things are changing, we know that expectations will change. But what exactly is this represented by, right? Well, within a political structure, since we're talking about politics, within a political structure, change takes place within policy. Change takes place within policy. So if we're talking about politics, at its root, at its foundation, change actually takes place within policy. So if we can get policy changes, then we actually change the structure of these paradigms, right? Also what we recognize is that at this point, once we realize that there is an encroachment of the new paradigm over the old paradigm, of the new attempt to change expectations over the existing expectations, not only is it the case that policy is actually going to be the source of change, but what we recognize is that there is going to be resistance, right? So that resistance starts exactly at this point, right? So this point wherein policy changes are enacted to obviously change the actual paradigm of the status quo, to usher in this new paradigm, if you will, to change the ground, right, to change the framework with which these paradigms exist. Those who have the foresight, right, those who have the knowledge, recognize that the last sort of bastion of hope in order to maintain the status quo is to resist the new paradigm, right? So I'll say that again. Those who attempt to defend the status quo recognize at the point of policy change that this is the last hope to defend the status quo, right? Technically speaking, that is the definition of obstructionist, right? So what is political obstructionism? Political obstructionism results from, and I'll write this down, so I'll just political obstructionism results from a recognition. Political obstructionism results from a recognition, specifically this recognition, right, that policy changes may result actually, policy changes may result, okay, so that policy changes may result in a change in expectation, right? If the policy is currently that it is not allowable for an individual to force a medical provider or insurance provider to cover pre-existing circumstances for all the reasons that I said before, and if I recognize that there is a policy that is attempting to change how we interpret that phenomenon, right? And instead of looking at a lapse in coverage and a sickness that happens as a lapse as a problem that the person seeking insurance has to deal with, rather to look at that lapse in coverage as something that, since this individual served their country and paid taxes and made contributions, is entitled to, right? They're entitled to coverage and entitled not to be penalized. Well, that's a change, right? So if we say that political obstructionism results from a recognition, and we'll talk about that, that policy changes may result in what? New expectations. E-X-P-E-C-T-A-T-I-O-N-S. New expectations, right? Then what? Then what we realize, since it's going to create new expectations, and we assume that this paradigm isn't meeting those expectations, by definition, it can't meet those expectations, then a new paradigm must be created to address the change in expectation. Okay. Political obstructionism results from a recognition that policy changes may result in new expectations. Then a new paradigm must be created to address the change in expectation. We have to create a new paradigm to answer this new expectation, right? The new expectation is we as a population, if it's true that we as a population actually have this expectation, if it's not, then this is all false, right? But if it is true that, with respect to just an example, that the population has the expectation that pre-existing circumstances won't serve as an inhibitor to medical coverage or an inhibitor to getting medical care, if that is the expectation, and the current paradigm doesn't address that expectation, then it's obvious that we'll need a new paradigm to address that expectation, right? So you can see why there's going to be resistance, right? Resistance, or technically speaking, political obstructionism, results from the attempt to define what the population's expectations are. I believe the population is saying X. We believe the population is saying Y. I believe the population has an expectation for A. We believe the population has an expectation for B, right? What might end up happening is the following.